Hello, my name's Ernie. I'm a resident from East LA, and what I want to do today is do a reading of the history of lowriding in Whittier Boulevard, East LA. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to address the lowrider community to understand where did lowriding in Whittier Boulevard begin. So I have to historically go back into time and kind of lay the framework for you so that you understand how did we get here? How did we end up cruising in Whittier Boulevard, East LA? So, having said that, I wrote this article, so I'll be reading it and here and there maybe explaining some finer points. And so bear with me as I read. In this article, I'm going to focus on lowriderology. That is the cruising history of Whittier Boulevard, East LA. Now, perhaps this is probably the first time you heard the term lowriderology. Actually, it's made up of two terms, lowrider and theology, putting them both together. And now what we have is the terminology lowriderology, which is the cruising history of Whittier Boulevard, East LA. I believe that the lowrider community is ready for a foundational teaching of lowrider history in Whittier Boulevard, East LA. The way I'm going to approach this article is I'm going to focus how Whittier Boulevard, East LA became the promised land of the lowrider community. In order for me to develop this land, we need to go back to the early 1920s when our grandparents settled in the community of Maravilla. As they were coming from Mexico, they saw this land filled with beautiful flowers and said, "Que maravilla, this is the land we're going to settle in." So that from 3rd Street to Floral Drive is where the raza lived. The people all knew each other. They would help each other out if there was a need, and they also watched out for their community. In the community of Maravilla, there was culture and vida as the Pachucos played their guitars and sung Las Chicanas. So basically what I'm trying to explain here is the historical context as our people came from Mexico and they ended up, as we would know, the community of Maravilla, because during the early 20s, the land had beautiful flowers that were nurtured and actually put together by the Japanese. And so when our grandparents came over, they seen this land filled with beautiful flowers, and that's where the phrase came from, as they said, "Que maravilla." I know that the term is used many times in a negative way, always speaking about gang violence and etc. But in this context, it's in the positive historical context, okay? So we noticed that from 3rd Street to Floral Drive, that's where the raza lived in historically speaking. And so when the Pachucos used to go down Whittier Boulevard, East LA to sightsee because they had the good stores and beautiful women, but there was tension between the Pachucos and the Russians. There was times the Pachucos had to fight them. Then you had the Jewish store owners who did not like the Pachuco lifestyle, so they would call the sheriffs and they would arrest them or escort them out of Whittier Boulevard, sending the Pachucos a message: "You are not welcome on Whittier Boulevard." This went on from the late 30s all the way to the early 50s because the Pachucos kept coming back to the boulevard. So we notice historically, as the Pachucos used to come to Whittier Boulevard to sightsee, there was this tension going on between the Russians and the Pachucos, and also we had the Jewish store owners who did not care so much for the Pachuco lifestyle. So they were being harassed, and the bottom line, it was old-fashioned racism, and so they would either arrest them or escort them back to their community, which was from 3rd Street to Floral Drive, and having sent a message to them that they didn't want them, they were not welcome on Whittier Boulevard. Then in the mid-50s, the government began to buy houses in the community of Maravilla so that they would be able to build the 60 freeway. Yet at the same time, many Jews and Russian families began to move out of East LA. This opened the door for families who lived in the community of Maravilla to move down by Whittier Boulevard. So historically, as the government began to buy homes in the community of Maravilla, now that those families had finances, and yet at the same time, Russian and Jewish families were now moving out of East LA. That opened the door for our people to come down and begin to move or buy homes closer to Whittier Boulevard. Then, this opened the door for families who lived in the community of Maravilla to move down by Whittier Boulevard. It was then that the Chicanos who had cars began to lower them because they wanted to develop their own style, something different from the hot rods. As these early Chicano lowriders would be hanging out in their community, one of them would say, "Let's take a trip down Whittier Boulevard." They would cruise through the boulevard, then go back to their hangout. They did not stay and hang out on Whittier Boulevard because they were not welcome. The highway patrol and the sheriffs will pull over these early Chicano lowriders for having their cars too low. And yet, at the same time, they were sending a message to the early Chicano lowriders: you are not welcome on the boulevard. So during this time in the mid-50s, we noticed that the Chicanos who lived in the community, as they were to go down Whittier Boulevard and take a trip down Whittier Boulevard. Now this is important. They didn't cruise down Whittier Boulevard during this time frame and hang out. What they actually did is they took a trip down Whittier Boulevard. They took a trip down Whittier Boulevard, and they began to leave the Whittier Boulevard because there was still that tension between the races. During this time, there was a transition taking place on the boulevard from seeing Jews and Russians to many Chicanos and Chicanas coming down Whittier Boulevard. Then, in the early or mid-60s, the Chicano lowriders began to cruise the boulevard on a Sunday afternoon, even though they were not welcome. This is important for the readers to understand because as we move into the early 70s, where many Chicanos were coming out of the Vietnam War, the lowrider community began to cruise Whittier Boulevard, East LA on Sunday night. That is to say that the lowrider community ushered in Boulevard nights. Then in the mid-70s, the lowrider communities began to cruise Whittier Boulevard Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night. The boulevard had reached its fulfillment in cruising history as Chicanos and Chicanas came from all over to cruise the promised land, Whittier Boulevard, East LA. Cruising the boulevard did not happen overnight. It took years in Chicano power as the raza pressed forward. That is to say, as the Pachucos who laid the foundation in the late 30s until the early 50s, then the early Chicano lowriders built on that foundation from the mid-50s through the 60s. Now Whittier Boulevard, East LA became the promised land of the lowrider community. Every Chicano and Chicana's dream was to come down Whittier Boulevard and get their car seen because this is where the car show was at this time. The owners of these cars were satisfied cruising Whittier Boulevard, East LA because they knew that they were cruising through Chicano history, culture, and vida. So then from the early 70s to the late 70s, Whittier Boulevard, East LA had become the promised land of the lowrider community. Then in 1978, they filmed the movie Boulevard Nights. All the cruising scenes were filmed from Ford Boulevard to Arizona Avenue. These streets were set apart for Chicano history, cruising, and vida. This is why I call these streets the Boulevard Cruise of Fame. This is important for Chicanos and Chicanas to understand so that as they cruise these streets, they can do it low and slow and brown and proud. The movie Boulevard Nights took the lowrider community to another level as the world was now able to see our Chicano culture and vida. This is why I call Whittier Boulevard, East LA the promised land of the lowrider community, because people from all over were coming to the boulevard and experiencing Chicano culture and vida. The movie also motivated other Chicanos and Chicanas to cruise in their own cars or their own cities. The foundation that the Pachucos laid and the early Chicanos built upon has also moved into other cities. This is why Whittier Boulevard, East LA is looked upon as the foundation of cruising history. The movie Boulevard Nights also was used to show that the lowrider community, why they closed the boulevard. That was because of violence on the street. The glory of the boulevard had departed and the streets looked empty like a ghost town. That is to say that those bombs and lowriders no longer lit up Whittier Boulevard, East LA with beauty and splendor. So then, it's important that we understand the history of the boulevard so that we be able to press forward and learn from the past and not make the same mistakes. I thank you for this opportunity, for allowing me to be able to share a piece of this article that I had written. So thank you very much and have a nice day.